Good morning, Eden. My name is Josh Carney, and I'm here with Josh Stothers, and we're both pastors here in Sydney, and we have created the Good Morning Eden podcast so that we can start seeing the world God's way in his original intention for us, which is in the Garden of Eden. So we're super excited to be with you guys. This is episode 14, and we're super excited to dive into chapter Mark today. So I'm going to hand it over to Josh, who's going to lead us out in reading.
Awesome. So today we're covering Mark chapter 9, verse 1 through to verse 29. And I'm reading from the NIV for those interested. And he said to them, "Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see that the kingdom of God has come with power." After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say. They were so frightened. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud, "This is my son whom I love. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. They kept the matter to themselves, discussing what rising from the dead meant. And they asked him, "Why do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first?" Jesus replied, "To be sure, Elijah does come first and restores all things. Why then is it written that the Son of Man must suffer much and be rejected? But I tell you, Elijah has come, and they have done to him everything they wished, just as it is written about him." When they came to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them, and the teachers of the law arguing with them. As soon as the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him. "What are you arguing with them about?" he asked. A man in the crowd answered, "Teacher, I brought you my son, who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not." "You unbelieving generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." So they brought him. And when the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked the boy's father, "How long has he been like this?" "From childhood," he answered. "It has often thrown him into fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." "If you can," said Jesus, "everything is possible for one who believes." Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe, help me overcome my unbelief." When Jesus saw the crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the impure spirit. "You deaf and mute spirit," he said, "I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." The spirit shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. The boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him to his feet, and he stood. After Jesus had gone indoors, his disciples asked him privately, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" And he replied, "This kind can come out only by prayer."
Whoa.
Yeah, wow. quite a couple of stories there. I've always been puzzled, particularly by that last story, many times over. So I'm glad we get a chance to unpack it today.
Yeah.
But I guess let's start at what we call the Transfiguration, a very iconic part of the Gospels, the story of Jesus. Very exciting part too. Do you want to start us off there, Josh?
Yeah, I think it's super important that the transfiguration is tied to the previous story where Jesus reveals his identity, because the question that Jesus asks them, "Who do you say I am?" is in effect answered by this story in a real way. and Jesus is revealing his divinity to them in a powerful way. And so the word transfigure means to change. In the Greek, it's the word metamorphon. And yeah, I think it's where we get the word metamorphosis, if I'm being honest.
Yeah.
Yep. Sweet. I took a wild punt at that.
No, one of the commentaries I read, it was like, this
Amazing.
is where we get the word metamorphosis.
There you go. Yeah. There you go. And so, yeah, it's just Jesus changing, and ultimately it's revealing who he really is, which is awesome. And so I think there's a couple of awesome things that we need to understand going into it. In verse 2, it talks about how after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain. And so straight away, right there, is some allusions to Mount Sinai. Because in the book of Exodus, when God meets with the people of Israel, he meets them at a mountain called Sinai. And it talks about how God's spirit God's presence descended on a mountain for 6 days, and on the seventh day, he actually invited Moses up to be with him. And so it could be the fact that Mark is alluding to this idea that there's going to be another encounter with God's presence by alluding to the 6-day theme.
It's very out of character for Mark, because normally between stories, he's always writing like, immediately this happened, or straight away, whatever. But this time he's like, 6 days. It's like very... Okay, like we're tying up some loose ends there, which is very uncharacteristic for that gospel. Yeah,
very, very, very much so. And so the second allusion, again, is that this story takes place on a mountain just like Mount Sinai. And all throughout Scripture, mountains are a significant place because in the ancient world of thinking, in their way of thinking, mountains were the places where heaven and earth kind of overlapped, and that's where you'd go up and experience the presence of God.
Yep.
And it's a real big Eden link as well, because when you look at the geography of the Garden of Eden, the Garden of Eden is actually situated on top of a mountain as well. And you know that because when you're reading the geography of Genesis 2, you'll see that there are streams that are flowing out and flowing from the Garden of Eden, and something can only flow out of something else when it's kind of got a source from a higher place.
An incline.
The incline,
Yes.
yeah, there you go. And so, this is kind of like another link to Eden, really, because we're getting a revelation of who God is in this moment, and it's Jesus. And so it's a super exciting story, but what else have you got that I may have missed so far?
Yeah, no, I think, I think it also, it sort of marks the halfway point of Mark is what I was going to say, and then I realized it's like a pun. Okay, I'm sorry. All right, it kind of marks a significant halfway point. We talked last week about Jesus revealing himself as, Peter talked about him being the Messiah, Jesus admitting that's true. So it's like this marker of his identity. But we also got the same thing at the very beginning of the gospel. Right, so it's almost like a repeat. There's a lot of repeats here of the baptism of Jesus. So I don't know if you were going to talk about this, but there's a few crossovers. Obviously, the main one being that there's a voice from heaven that comes out, and it says, "This is my son." At the beginning, it says, "In whom I'm well pleased," but this time it says, "Listen to him," because we're all not very good at doing that apparently, and we needed this. So that's the voice that comes out and says that. And interestingly enough, Peter, James, and John are the first 3 disciples called after that point too. And at this point, they're at this point as well, if that makes sense. So they were at that first point, sort of, but then this one, they're there too.
Yep.
So it's like this marking to remind us and be more of a full revelation of who Jesus is. It's an interesting, recap. And as far as, you mentioned the mirror of Moses, how there was the 6 days and everything. But also when Moses would come down from the mountain, his skin was shining, but on the mountain with Jesus, he was shining.
Yeah.
So God appears in a veiled form, overshadowing with a cloud, and same thing with Moses. He also appeared in a veiled form, overshadowing with a cloud. And the voice speaks. So it's heaps of mirrors here with Moses. One interesting thing, and I'll admit here, maybe I'm going out on a limb because I actually didn't see commentators talk about this, but this is just something I was thinking, and I'd like to hear your thoughts. So Jesus shows up, right? They go up this mountain together, and God reveals himself through Jesus. It's mirroring what happened with Moses, but it also, the same sort of thing happened with Elijah, right? He went up a mountain and God revealed himself up there on a mountain to him too, right?
Yeah.
And so now Moses, Elijah, and Jesus are all up there on the mountain. So the first revealing was like Moses, big loud fire, thunder. But then Elijah plays on that by saying he wasn't in the fire, he wasn't in the wind, he wasn't in the thunder, he was a small whisper. And then Jesus goes up the mountain, and then Moses and Elijah are there, but then Jesus is the revelation of God at that point.
Yeah, wow. He's building on it.
Yeah, right? That makes sense, right?
Dude, that makes sense. You should
Yeah.
write a commentary.
Maybe this is my commentary. Well, now we know. If anybody copies me, it's here, it's recorded, we all know. I said it. No, there's probably some other scholar who said it first. But I was just like, surely there's a link here, right? There's got to be something.
Yeah.
Anyway.
No, but that's true. I think that it's like building on something there. What I think is interesting is when it says that his clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could ever bleach. That's a clear allusion to Daniel chapter 7. And in Daniel chapter 7, Daniel is there and he's having this vision of all these beasts and whatnot. And it talks about the Ancient of Days, and it talks in verse 9 of Daniel chapter 7, it says, I watched as the thrones were put in place, and the Ancient One, being God, sat down to judge. His clothing was as white as snow, his hair like purest wool. He sat on a fiery throne with wheels of blazing fire, and a river of fire was pouring out, flowing from his presence. And so that's a pretty vivid image of God there.
I just love the thought of a throne with like fire wheels.
Fire wheels.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know why, but it screams like Hot Wheels. Like, you know, like,
That is literal Hot Wheels.
literal Hot Wheels, you know.
But it's super interesting because it says that his clothes were as white as snow.
Yes.
And later on, in a couple of verses later, it talks about how the Son of Man, he approached the one who was sitting on the throne, the Ancient of Days. But in Mark, it kind of shows that Jesus is the one that's dazzling white, just like the Daniel 7 figure. And it's almost like Mark is combining the Son of Man imagery and the Ancient of Days imageries in Jesus.
Wow.
Because Jesus calls himself the Son of Man after this. But, you know, the way that he's presented isn't just as a Son of Man figure, it's also as that Ancient of Days figure that's sitting on the throne that has all these incredible characteristics about him too.
Yeah, wow.
So it's kind of, you know, I didn't read, I'm doing OU. I didn't read a commentator that said that, but I'm noticing that is what God is referred to in the Old Testament, and that is what Jesus is referred to in this passage here. And it's kind of like the marker of his identity as God here on the earth. That is, you know, part of the Trinity, because obviously the Father is a part of this story too. But yeah, Jesus isn't just some random as in the salvation story. It's actually all leading to him, which is kind of why Moses and Elijah are there too.
Yeah.
Did you have anything to say on them?
Oh, I was going to cover, like, I mean, for us, we kind of think it's kind of random, just like those two. Like, there are so many people in the Old Testament, like, why those two?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess Moses was seen as, like, the first and greatest prophet. And Elijah, he was also a great prophet, but he had that whole thing of being, like, swept away on a chariot of fire. Like, he didn't really die. I mean, even Moses, it's a bit of a questionable death, because it talks about how the Lord buried him. So, like, what does that mean? Did he, like, take him? I don't know. Anyway, so, yeah, there's kind of some interesting about, like, why it's those two in particular. Like, they didn't necessarily have a normal parting of earth.
Yeah.
Like, they left on some sort of special terms with God. So it kind of makes sense that they're, like, coming back in their own, well, you know, in this very particular instance. But yeah, these two figures, again, point forward to Jesus in a lot of ways. So it makes a lot of sense that they would be the ones who are there. Yeah. Did you want to?
Yeah, well, some commentators that I said that Moses stands for the law and Elijah represents the prophets.
Oh.
That's one way of thinking about why they're there and cool. How the law and the prophets are pointing towards Jesus. And it's interesting as well when God, the Father, says, "This is my Son whom I love, listen to him." In Deuteronomy 18, Moses is prophesying the future prophet that would come, basically saying there's going to be another prophet greater than I. And the words that he literally uses in Deuteronomy 18 is listen to him. And so it's almost like God is quoting that passage in the Old Testament there to identify that with Jesus and who he is, and that this is the prophet that Israel has been waiting for all the way since the time of Moses. And so, yeah, that's kind of one way of thinking about why Moses and Elijah is there, that Moses stands for the law, Elijah stands for the prophets. And you're right, both of them had questionable deaths. Well, Elijah didn't die.
Yeah.
And Moses, who knows?
He died,
but did he really?
Yeah. It's like he died, like ... question mark, you know? I don't know.
Super strange.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love, should we move on to Peter's response?
Yep.
Yeah, I love how I just love the way this is worded. I like want to giggle every time. Even when I was reading it then, I kind of want to giggle how it's like, he offered to build, well, maybe I should just read it again. He offered to build them the shelters. Where is it? Oh, yeah. In verse 5, Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." In brackets, he did not know what to say because they were so frightened, you know? Like I kind of love how like the very wording of it just sort of calls him out. Like he had no idea what to say at this moment, but he said something.
Yep.
Which good on him.
Classic Peter.
Yeah. So I saw a few different reasons of why scholars thought he would have said this. Yeah, 3 of which I found stood out to me, but I don't know if you had other ones. One was that he was just enjoying the moment and wanted to prolong it. So it's like, let's build some shelters. Let's make this a long-term thing. We can all hang out, you know? Like I want to hang out with Moses and Elijah and Jesus. Yeah, let's do it. We're in this moment. Let's continue the party, right? Possible. Another one was that they thought it was like, thinking back to the Festival of Tabernacles, which celebrates. So basically during the Festival of Tabernacles, the Jewish people would go out and live in these little kind of like tents, but they're made out of like sticks and branches, essentially to relive the experience of the Exodus, but in a way that's like a family tradition and celebration, which I just love. I think it sounds so cool. So yeah, they go out and stay in these things for, I think it's like a week.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, they go out and stay in these little, it's like, yeah, made of like leaves on the roof. So because this whole moment is kind of reflecting Moses and what happened on Mount Sinai, that he's like, oh, well, like the logical thing to do here is to, build these little tabernacles here because we're like a modern, I guess, Israelites in the wilderness kind of thing, which is also an interesting explanation. And the last one, which I also found interesting, was because Peter kind of wanted a militant Jesus, that he was like, this is like the beginning of like our base of operations. We're going to set up the shelters here and make like our fortress, our base of operations here on the mountain. And that's where we're going to do our thing from here. Did you have any other explanations for why you might have said that?
To be honest, I only had 2. You kind of covered one, the idea that they wanted to prolong the experience a little bit. And the second one is similar to your third one. Okay. But it's kind of talking about, James Edwards said that the Jewish people, they kind of had this idea that God was going to once again like tabernacle with the people just like he did in the book of Exodus. Yep. And there's one kind of like Jewish writing that isn't in scripture, but it's just one of the things that they read that said, make a right confession to the Lord and bless the King of the ages so that once again his dwelling may be erected with you in joy. And even Josephus, the Jewish historian that talks a little bit about Jesus and the early church, kind of talked about the hope of the tabernacle coming back and that experience of the wilderness with God's presence being with them, being a reality for them again. Oh, cool. And so, yeah, Peter is basically looking at this crazy moment of transfiguration and seeing Elijah, seeing Moses there and thinking, all right, this time that was prophesied, it's happening now. That means the kingdom that Jesus is talking about is about to begin. So let's get this party started. And yeah, kind of like your base of operations, like this is the beginning of the kingdom takeover. Yeah. And yeah, James Edwards says, so funny, what Peter must come to, not funny, it's powerful. Sorry. What Peter must come to understand, however, is that God is providing his own tabernacle in which to dwell, and that tabernacle is Jesus. Oh. And so, yeah, again, Jesus is just changing the disciples' categories of things, which is just what he does best, really. But yeah, a couple of reasons why. I think they all kind of relate to one another, really, in some way, shape or form. Yeah,
I don't think we're ever going to know the exact reason why. It's kind of one of those things, like you could read it in a few ways, and that's okay. The point is, though, that Peter missed the point.
Yeah.
Yeah, like he didn't quite get what to do with the moment. And to be fair, like, who would? Like it's like,
Not me.
It's a crazy moment, and I applaud him for just saying something. To be honest, that's why I like Peter. I just feel like he's so relatable. So those are some explanations as to why I said it. Personally, I like the one. I probably am drawn most to the idea that he wanted this to be a moment that lasted longer. And so that's the one that for me stands out. But, readers, you might read a few different explanations and think something else fits in the story better, and that's okay. Because I think all of us really, when we have those, we all have these kind of mountaintop experiences with God. We have moments where we feel particularly close, like maybe there's been a miracle, maybe there's, it's a revival week, a week of worship, a big camp, a conference, or whatever it is that you go to, and they can feel like these awesome, or like summer camp, feel these mountaintop moments with God. And sometimes we just want to really cling on to those and hold on. And so that's what I feel when I read this. And maybe I'm just reading too much of my own experience into it, but we just want to cling on to that. But kind of what I love about this story is that in this story, like they go down the mountain and start dealing with real life again.
Yeah.
And that's real. Like we have these mountaintopic moments with Jesus, and they're awesome. They build our relationship, but those mountaintops are meant to equip us for the regular life and for the valleys to come. They're meant to be those moments we hold on to, not moments that we never leave, but moments that we take with us into the regular, everyday ups and downs of real life.
Yeah, 100%.
We keep going down the mountain. Or anything else you wanted to add to?
Yeah, just the cloud. The cloud also is super important to this story. And, in Exodus chapter 40, after the Israelites had created the tabernacle, the cloud of God's presence entered the tabernacle. In 1 Kings 8, when Solomon finished building the temple, the cloud of God's presence entered the temple there. And so that same cloud is present in this story as well. And it's around Jesus and the disciples, which is really, really cool. And I love what happened at the end of this story, because they had this experience, and then suddenly when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. And James Edwards said something powerful, that the one who calls disciples to follow him does not abandon them for glory, but turns from glory to accompany them on the way to Jerusalem and the cross.
Wow.
And I just thought that was awesome, like Jesus had just a small kind of homecoming with the people that truly knew who he was, and he kind of had an experience of who he actually is in terms of the power that he had. And instead of thinking, you know what, I'm going to go back and chill with them, he just saw his flop disciples that didn't know what to say and were scared and was speaking out of turn, and decided they're still worth dying for. I'm going to go on my way to Jerusalem, and I'll die on that cross for them.
Yeah, well.
And I just thought that was a really, really powerful thing. And so, their moment comes to an end, and they begin coming down the mountain, as you say.
Yeah. When, random question, but in the chapter before, how Jesus says that some of you will not, you'll see the full glory. Oh, you'll see the glory of God before you pass away. Some of you will see that.
Yeah.
Do you think he's referring to this moment?
I think so.
Yeah, because I think people have read that and thought it meant you'll see the second coming of Jesus before you pass away, but obviously that didn't happen. So I'm wondering if at least here it's referring to this transfiguration.
Well, they're at least connected, because it's literally the same. Because that verse is verse 1 of this chapter, and the very next line is the beginning of the transfiguration story. So I think they're at least connected.
Yeah, I think so too. Maybe a scholar listening can correct us on that. I'd be interested to hear some more thoughts.
True.
But I think before we leave this, there is something I wanted to read from David Garland, who did the NIV application commentary. He wrote a cool little passage just I think sums up this story really well too. And then we'll move on. We'll go down the mountain. The transfiguration, therefore, serves to confirm that the suffering Jesus will endure is not incompatible with his glory. This scene functions like a hologram. For a brief moment, the disciples glimpse the truth as divine glory shines through the veil of suffering. It foreshadows the time when God will gloriously enthrone Jesus after the degradation on the cross. The white flash of the splendor to come brightens the dark cloud of tribulation that that presently hangs over Mark's first readers and confirms Jesus' promise that those who follow and suffer for him will not have done so in vain.
Yeah, that's so powerful.
Yeah, because remember, the people reading this story are people who are suffering persecution, right, in Rome. And so when you read a story like this, it's like, oh yeah, that's Jesus, like in all his glory and power. Like that would have been an awesome thing to take with you into whatever you're going to go through.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got the cloud. We're going down the mountain. Ready to go down?
I'm down.
All right, we're going. So they looked around. They no longer saw anyone around them except Jesus. The moment's over. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they'd seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. And this is important. Josh, you spoke a lot about the messianic secret earlier on in the podcast, like in earlier episodes. But this is the first time, I don't know if you have notes on this, that he gives the messianic secret again, but this time with a time frame.
Yeah.
He's like, don't tell anyone until this moment, which is cool. I don't know. I think it just adds an extra layer of mystery and intrigue. But did you have more to add to that?
Yeah, it's just the only thing I would add to that is, Jesus' revelation of his divinity can only be understood fully when it's tied with his death and resurrection on the cross.
Yep.
Because he's not just some powerful figure just for the sake of being a powerful figure. He's actually, this God is the one that died on the cross. And ultimately, this is a revelation of love. Yeah. And the fact that he tied that to, he tied the messianic secret to him rising from the dead again, is kind of just showing, you will only understand why my life means something when you realize that I lived and died for you and rose again for you. So, yeah, I thought that was really interesting. Larry, Big Laz.
Big Laz, back at it again.
Big Laz, the commentator, taught me that. So, yeah.
I like that you've gone from saying his full name to
Can I be honest? The reason why I said
the commentator.
The reason why I said Big Laz, I blanked on his surname. So I'm like, I know it's H. Hurtado? Let's go with Hurtado.
Larry the commentator. All right. So then they have this interesting conversation. So they ask Jesus, why do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first? Jesus replied, to be sure, Elijah does come first and restores all things. Why then is it written that the Son of Man must suffer much and be rejected? But I tell you, Elijah has come, and they have done to him everything they wished, just as it's written about him. Very kind of confusing, but what they're kind of quoting here is, I'm just trying to find it. I've got it here. It's from Micah, the book. Malachi. Yep, from Malachi. Where is it? It's in my notes somewhere.
I have here Malachi 4.
Yeah, it is Malachi 4. Sorry, I can't find my note on it. Do you want to just, do you want to read Malachi 4? Do you have it there?
Oh, I don't have the full verse.
Oh, right. But essentially what happens is they're referring to this piece of scripture from Malachi, I found it, sorry. Malachi 4, chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. Behold, I will send you Elijah, the prophet, before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And he will turn the hearts of fathers to their children and the hearts of children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a decree of utter destruction. So this is where the idea of Elijah has to come back, and he's going to come forward.
Before the Messiah. Come back before the Messiah.
Yeah, before the Messiah. And I think what Jesus is getting at here, and maybe Josh can correct me, but John the Baptist was like the forerunner for Jesus, and he sort of played the role of Elijah by being the forerunner to the gospel.
Yep.
Yeah, to Jesus' ministry. So that's why, in my understanding, that's why Jesus says Elijah has come, and they've done to him everything they wished, just as written about him.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you have anything to add to that?
No, I agree with you. I think I believe it's one of the other synoptic gospels, Luke or Matthew. I can't remember off the top of my head, but Jesus actually says it's explicitly there that he's talking about Elijah.
Oh, right.
Which is super, super good.
Bringing the clarity.
Yeah. And what's interesting is, Jesus, he does affirm, Elijah's coming, like the role of the Elijah figure. Mm-hmm. But he also ties that with, just because he's going to restore everything doesn't mean it's going to happen peacefully. It's actually going to happen through suffering. And that's why Jesus says, why then is it written that the Son of Man must suffer much and be rejected? And that's a big allusion to, Isaiah when it's talking about the suffering servant in Isaiah 52. Isaiah 53, sorry.
Yep.
And, how that suffering servant was going to be handed over for the people's sin and iniquity, and he was going to suffer on their behalf. And so, that end of the day, Elijah moment can only happen through the suffering of that messianic figure, that suffering servant. So, yeah, that's what I thought was really interesting, and that's about it for me with this story.
Cool. I think it seems pretty straightforward. Okay, let's now go on to Jesus healing a boy possessed by an impure spirit. I won't read through the whole story, but just some interesting points here. I think often we read this story, and as modern readers, we think of modern medicine, modern, what's the word? I don't know. Yeah, modern understanding of disease and things, and a lot of people see this and they're just like, is it an evil spirit or does this dude have epilepsy? Which is an interesting way to look at the story, and I think in the world of the Bible, it can sort of be both, if that makes sense. They can believe people can receive something like epilepsy and it's done through, like, there's a spiritual nature to it as well. Whereas today, we don't really see that. We see there's like, someone can be possessed by a spirit, or they have some sort of medical disease, right?
Yeah.
But in the world, and the worldview of the Bible, they seem to be a lot more connected than what we make them today. Did you have anything?
No, I agree.
Yeah, okay.
You said what I was going to say.
Yeah, okay, cool. So the idea of someone receiving healing, you can be healed spiritually, and it can also heal you medically, like physically, which we've kind of seen already a bit in this gospel. I think we've talked about people being healed of their sins and then they can walk and whatever, So I guess life was viewed more, maybe holistically, be a good word for that.
Yeah.
We separate the spiritual and the physical a lot more. And what's right and wrong, I don't know. It's just the way it is. That's just the way they see it. That's the way we see it. Maybe there's more we can learn. Obviously, there'd be more that the ancient world can learn from us today, but there's probably also things we can learn from the ancient view of seeing these things as more linked. Because obviously, when your body is suffering, it affects you spiritually.
Yeah.
Like when you're, like, for example, like a few weeks ago, I hurt my shoulder a bit, right? And then I was playing guitar at church, like worship leading, and the strap was pushing on the part of my shoulder that was hurting, right? While I was trying to play guitar. And it was distracting me from my worship. It was making me like frustrated as I'm trying to like worship God. Obviously, that's like a really minor issue, or like a really minor thing. Like it's not a big deal. But even in that small thing, I could sense like there was a disruption in my worship and my spirituality from a physical ailment, right?
Yeah.
So obviously you take this on bigger scales, like when your whole body feels like broken. Like, people feel like, man, this is not God's way of my life. Like, this is not the Eden ideal. Like, in Eden, our bodies are whole. And, because of the brokenness of sin in the world, it affects us physically and spiritually, like in tandem, both at the same time in ways. I'm not sitting here saying that, like, we can just pray away all diseases. Sure, God can heal anybody. I do thoroughly believe that. But there is also a place for medicine too, as I've talked about in prior episodes. But I just think like medicine can also have spiritual benefits for people too, in a way. Yeah, I guess just something I've been thinking about with this.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting thought. Definitely.
Do you want to push on?
Yeah, let's push on. This story is, there's not a lot to unpack in terms of cultural background for things. This story is very straightforward. With the things that happen. But, I think the very last line of the story, the last two verses of the story, after Jesus had gone indoors, his disciples asked him privately, why couldn't we drive it out? And he replied, this kind can only come out only by prayer.
What were they doing?
What were they doing?
100%.
Yep. Larry Hurtado said that this is not just another miracle story or another example of Jesus' power over demons. It also is intended to instruct Mark's readers, the church, about their task of continuing the work of Jesus. And the way that we go about continuing the work of Jesus is a dependence of God in prayer. And I just thought that was a really interesting kind of frame, because I always wondered, are there different levels to demons? Are some demons stronger than other demons and
interesting.
and whatnot? But yeah, when I read that from Big Lazer, I just thought that's actually a really interesting way of thinking it, because the disciples say, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" Like they were evaluating what they had done.
Especially like just not that long ago, they had successfully driven out demons. Like they went on that missionary journey for Jesus, for the like preaching the kingdom and all that. So the fact that now they couldn't, it does make the reader at least ask some questions here. I'm like, well, they did it before. Surely they could do it again now. Surely they know what to do. So,
and perhaps it's because they had been doing it for so long, they forgot where they were getting their power from.
Oh, nice.
And they started thinking about their own performance and their own abilities, and Jesus is just reminding them, hey, you can only get this out in prayer. And, James Edwards, he says, the inadequacy of the disciples is not their fault, nor should it have the effect of impairing either their faith or fellowship with Christ. Rather, inadequacy drives the disciples to prayer, which is God's gift to them, and another form of fellowship with Jesus as their Lord. And I just thought that was a really interesting quote there too, because, as disciples and followers of Jesus, we are inadequate for pretty much every single task that comes our way.
Yeah.
And that's the point, because the moment that we think that we are confident enough to do things in our own strength is the moment that we're no longer relying on God's strength to get us through things. And really, God's strength is the only thing that can get us through things. Yeah. So, that's just a really awesome reminder about this story.
Yeah. I also think, from what I understand, like the rabbi, maybe not the rabbi, but the Pharisees, and also like culturally, driving out demons had become a bit of a like cultural art form, like the right spices, the right incantations or whatever and all that kind of stuff. If you guys have seen, I think it's the first episode of The Chosen. I think it portrays it pretty well. Like you see there's a Pharisee who tries to like get the demon out of like a girl, and he's got like, I need this spice, and he comes in, he says these nice words and whatever, and he's like waving this, I don't know, like incense burner around or whatever. Doesn't do anything, right?
Yep.
Jesus comes along, spoiler, gets a demon out of her. But
Spoilers.
I think like, I wonder if they were also doing something like that. I wonder if they were just trying to do the like, I don't know, the cultural way of doing it. But like it is literally just as simple as like, just come back to prayer. There's some interesting notes here that in some translations it says prayer and fasting.
Yeah.
We think this actually comes around from, like this comes in later translations. It's not in the earliest manuscripts.
The fasting part?
Yeah. So the prayer has always been there, but the fasting part wasn't initially there. And they reckon it came from copyists over time who sort of wanted to add, or from my understanding, they wanted to add like a, maybe like a piety to it. Like they wanted to make it a bit, a bit deeper. Like the copyists of it, like, let's take this like serious prayer. Like it has to be prayer and fasting. Like, thinking monks in the tower. So they kind of added it. So I got this quote by scholar. So, I mean, this is from Ben Witherington III's book, but he says, but as Schweizer, who's a scholar, who I have not read, but Ben Witherington's quoting him, so I'm sure he's good.
Yep.
These later copyists who added and fasting misunderstood this passage, thinking prayer alone seems too simple. They were not able to perceive that what is simplest and most taken for granted is really most important, since it causes one to cease looking at himself and look to God. Mark wants to proclaim that this kind of discipleship does not result from the effectiveness of one's own piety, but only from the action of God.
Yeah,
which I thought was like a super cool, I don't know. Sometimes we read, I know there's a lot of talk about translations, which is right. And some people don't like when the newer translation take things away, but they don't realize that a lot of these things were added in later translations. That's why they're being taken away. And they're not gone. They're often just added as footnotes because they're still not necessarily bad ideas. Like obviously fasting is a good idea, but the core of this passage is not about religious piety. It's about just coming back to God and allowing Him to be your strength in your everyday and what you're doing.
Yep. And that actually links to my favorite part of this passage. which is the Father's response to Jesus. And, you know, we like, spoilers, everyone, Jesus heals the Son.
Yeah.
Jesus heals the Son, as we read.
Yep.
But the interaction that he had with the Father is just my favorite part because, you know, he says, if you can, like, help us. And Jesus says, you know, repeats him and says, if you can, anything is possible for the one who believes. And the boy's father says, I do believe, help me overcome my unbelief.
What a prayer.
And that is a prayer that I believe I need to pray daily, truly.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
Because, you know, this guy had the awareness of like, Lord, like, I know you can do it, but there's also a part of me that struggles with whether you will. So help me overcome that part of my life. And I just think that is the type of attitude that we should come into God's presence with. Not a fake facade of, you know, I've got all the right things to say and I'm, you know, have all the right Christian needs and stuff.
Yeah.
But, you know, if you are here today and you're struggling with your faith, come into God's presence and say, Lord, help me with my unbelief. Yeah. You know, God is not weak and he's not self-conscious enough to worry about that stuff.
Yeah.
In fact, he's willing and able to help, just like Jesus did. And so, yeah, that's just my encouragement from this passage, you know. Help me overcome my unbelief is just a prayer that Jesus is so ready and willing to answer.
That's so good, bro. I love that. Yeah. I have nothing else to add. That's a great place to finish.
Sweet.
Let's do some reflection questions.
Yep.
To finish off today. Do you want to start or do you want me to start?
How many do you have?
I can have 2.
All right, you can go first then.
Okay. Firstly, today we started off by looking at the Transfiguration. This amazing moment where God's glory is revealed. And so, listener at home, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, do you want a moment? Do you want to ask for a moment to have a fresh vision of the glory of God in your everyday life?
Yeah, fresh vision of the glory of God.
Yeah, just ask for it. See what he does.
Yeah, my question would be is, do you need to start depending on God in prayer more? Have you tried to live life in your own strength, in your own power? And are you realizing, man, I can't do it? So do you need to start depending on God more?
Yeah, that's good. And finally, maybe in a moment you've been kind of feeling tough season. Things aren't going well. Maybe your faith is struggling, like what we were talking about before. Do you need to just come to Jesus again and say, can you help me overcome my unbelief? It's okay. Just ask him. Yeah. There's no shame. There's no shame in that prayer. It's a beautiful, beautiful prayer. Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us today, everybody. We pray that you had a good morning Eden moment today, that you have seen in a new light God's way of being in the world. And so, yeah, may you be blessed in whatever's ahead. We would love to hear your feedback. So if you want to leave a comment, a review, a rating, we'd love to hear from you guys, and you can reach out and share with us some of your thoughts. Maybe there's something in this passage that we missed that you're like, why didn't you say this? Tell us. We want to hear about it. Yeah, we're trying to get everything, but yeah, we want to hear. So thank you so much. Be blessed, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye.
Bye.